kind of felt like it was relevant in some way.
I try.
I wish that people would use 3 stars more, because everything seems like 1 or 5 in internet discourse. It's either the best thing ever or it sucked. Okay, so I just want you to just look at this for a couple more moments, because I spent more time than I should have trying to make the font for the talk. Not this year. I did this last year for last year's Edmonton Expo, and I really wanted to make a good impression. And so I wanted to make the font look as close to Pacific Rim's poster as I could. So I spent more time than anyone should fiddling with fonts. But now we're going to leave it behind. And we're going to move on to an image of the Kelowna fires. I just realized that I need to do something to this very quickly. All right, back to the Kelowna fire. This is really where the genesis, not any neon genesis, for this talk began. This is where I started thinking about this intersection between giant monsters and the Book of Revelation, because I was working as the staff pastor, believe it or not, at those of you who know me well are like, you got to be kidding, at a Bible camp in Kelowna. And this guy was talking to me about, it was the year that this fire happened, or the year before, I can't remember. No, it was 2004. So he was talking to me about how he thinks that the monsters in the Book of Revelation are literally going to come up out of the sea. And I had this moment of, I just can't believe I'm having this conversation with somebody in the 21st century. So I had to ask him. I said, like, you actually think that the creatures, like, there's the beast out of the earth and the beast out of the sea, and there's this multi-headed red dragon, and I said, you really think we're going to see stuff like that? Because that sounds to me like Godzilla. And he's like, yes. I was like, this is an awkward conversation. And then about a week later, my wife had come out to visit, because I was out there for the entire summer, and so we decided we'd go see a movie, and we saw Steven Spielberg's War of the Worlds. And we were watching this particular scene where the tripods are coming up over the hill, and they're incinerating everybody. And because I'd been having this conversation with this guy about what he thought the end of the world would really be like, and he seemed rather gleeful about it. And now I'm watching this cinematic representation of the end of the world, and it's horrific as a PG movie could be in 2004. I think that's one of the great achievements of this movie, is that it's genuinely scary for a PG rating. I think Spielberg really carried something off there. But I sat in the theater, and it suddenly struck me that anyone who would be gleeful about the end of the world in the way that this young man was imagining war as sort of, you know, the doom coming to everyone, wants this to happen. And it was chilling to me. I thought, you know, I actually remember tearing up at that point and thinking, this is awful. What an awful perspective. And the next time I talked to the guy, I'm like, you need to stop thinking like that. H.G. Wells obviously thought that that sort of perspective was problematic, because when he wrote War of the Worlds, he included a religious figure, the curate. When I did this at the expo last year, I kept saying the curate, and people didn't know what I was talking about. I should have just said priest, but it wouldn't be quite close enough to what Wells was saying. But we could say priest. That's how he's envisioned in this comic book version of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. But Wells had been raised by a woman who was firmly into late 19th century apocalypticism in England, and he railed against it by creating the character of the curate in the War of the Worlds, if not by creating War of the Worlds in its entirety. Because what you have with War of the Worlds is a purely secular apocalypse, where prior, it's really hard to find perfectly secular apocalypses. Mary Shelley does one with sort of The Last Man, but it doesn't come across like this one. This one has the same sort of bowls of you know, wrath being poured upon the earth, except it's not God, it's aliens who are doing it. But this fellow mistakes it for what, you know, Revelation, he feels, predicted. And says, you know, this is just what we've had coming to us. And it's a perspective coming from somebody who was, like as I say, was reacting, was responding, criticizing this sort of apocalyptic imagination that, if you go back through history, the end of just about every century this happens. It's not something that we just recently cooked up. People have, at the end of calendar years, I guess God's on the same calendar as we are, the Gregorian one, and this is how it's all going to come down. But this guy's like, no, this is what we deserve. And it will inform where this concludes. I guess that's what I want to say about this at this point, is that the curate's imagination of passivity, he just lets it happen. He allows himself, he doesn't allow himself to get killed, but he does allow the idea that the Martians are God's judgment. And that, again, is a very chilling sort of perspective to have. What I find particularly problematic about all of this is that if you go to recent Christian fiction, and this is recent in the last 2,000 years, you've got these books, these Left Behind books. I don't know if you guys know these, but they were bestsellers. After the first 3 or 4 books have been published, they stopped being something that you just saw in the niche Christian bookstores, and you started seeing them when you'd walk in through the doors of Chapters Indigo. And they imagine the end of the world in a fictional way, but I just want you guys to look at the covers for them. I don't want to get into the particulars behind it. Let's just look at the marketing strategy for this, right? And that's Jack Chick. Jack Chick, they're probably very heavily influenced by Jack Chick's cartoons, but this is more sort of North American evangelical apocalyptic imagination. The world is in Satan's grip. Occult murders, drugs, raping, sodomizing, and looting is everywhere, yet these people will not repent. And so God sends all this awful stuff. I mean, it just looks like something straight out of a horror novel, or shall we say, an H.P. Lovecraft story. And so I also started linking these things up. This is a comic. This is a web comic that stopped being drawn for quite a few years after 9/11. The guy was doing it. 9/11 happened. He said, "I don't feel right about doing this anymore," because what he was doing was he was trying to take a literal pen to the images in the Book of Revelation and imagine them in that way. And there's an interesting correlation between what he imagines this one creature, these squid things, and Cthulhu from H.P. Lovecraft. But this is another intersection of literature that I think has informed the American apocalyptic. You have H.G. Wells with his secular apocalypse, which becomes sort of the alien invasion story. And then you also have H.P. Lovecraft imagining elder gods coming through a portal and destroying everything, which is now, again, a secular imagination taking a look at something very akin to the religious community's desire for the second coming to have all this occur. And I don't want to say that everybody who goes to church and hopes for these sorts of things is in this mode of imagination, but there is something that comes out of an imagination versed in this sort of apocalyptic that's very different from the one that I'm going to be talking about in just a bit. But H.P. Lovecraft imagined that the gods, whatever they were, these elder gods, these alien entities, would come through, and it was the sort of thing you didn't want to have happen. And there's cultists who want to have it happen, and they're working very hard to make it so. And just recently I read Peter Klein's 14, which isn't great literature. I don't even think H.P. Lovecraft's work is great literature. It's just very influential. But Peter Klein's has done this thing with a novel that has been staying at the top of the bestseller lists on Amazon and on some other of those online stores. And he's playing with the Lovecraft thing, but his Lovecraftian cultist comes across as a modern evangelical until the moment you realize he's a cultist. So Peter Klein's is able to sell me on the idea that this character is just going to church. He's just a little weird. He's just a little different than the people that he's in a building with, until he reveals that he's actually hoping for all of this to happen, right? And it's I have to wonder. I haven't talked to Peter Kleins about this, but I want to. I want to say, was this a intentional thing? Were you wanting to make commentary on that, or did you just want to use that as a way of sort of keeping the audience from knowing what's happening? But anyway, coming back to a Pokemon, because these are all things I want us to have in our in our heads before I round up to really where I want to go. Because there's a ton of stuff here, and I haven't finished thinking about these things. This is still a project in the works, in the making. But this guy did a Pokemon, right? He does the Christian apocalypse with Pokemon. Because you can do that. I mean, just look at it. Satan with multiple heads, he looks like a Pokemon, right? The beast, one of the beasts comes out of the earth. This one looks like a Pokemon. He takes the aesthetic of these, pocket monsters, which have a very strong correlation, by the way, to Japanese kaiju movies. When you get to destroy all monsters and it's just a free-for-all with all these guys in rubber suits, it's like WWE, but with kaiju. We're 2 steps away from somebody coming up with this card game. Okay, so I guess everything that I've wanted to sort of put into play at this point is that I have this guy who I have this encounter with, who tells me that this is something that he thinks is really going to happen. Then I have my revelation, as it were, unveiling. By the way, the word apocalypse didn't originally mean everything gets destroyed. It was unveiling, a revealing of something mysterious. And the apocalyptic language that the book of Revelation and other Christian and Jewish apocalyptic books are written in is more likely a code for talking about the way things are, not trying to predict the way they're going to be. And I can talk more about that later if you'd like to hear more. But I don't want to get bogged down on this at this point. But my revelation of sitting in a movie theater and going, wait a second, this is what the desire is. If if you're hoping for a literal apocalypse, it's you literally want something to come down and rain terror and blood and fire down upon people, and that's awful. It's an awful thing. And then if somebody literalizes this story, they get these sorts of images, these sort of Cthulhu-like gods coming through and destroying the earth. And H.P. Lovecraft is an American writer, a fairly influential American writer during the pulp era. And so where I see stuff like these Left Behind books is almost like the evangelical right wing playing out the book of Revelation in a very Lovecraftian sort of way. Like, Jesus comes back and it's really good for everybody who's in the fold, but for everybody else it's all this awful stuff, right? And so it becomes sort of an elder god thing, that the imagination of this stuff becomes dark elder gods rather than anything that we would want to have happen to us. Okay, another strain, because we've got a few strains now. And now I've got another one for you, Godzilla. So Godzilla starts out as a metaphor for the atomic bomb. Okay, if you didn't know that, now you do. I don't need to go into this at length. But there comes this point for the studio that made Godzilla where they realize that they can make a ridiculous amount of money by having Godzilla fight other creatures. In the 1970s, they came up with a mecha Godzilla, a robot Godzilla. And initially, the robot Godzilla was bad, and because that's at a point when Godzilla was still a hero. And then in the 1980s, they reimagined Godzilla as villain one more time. And so now they had to come up with a new explanation for what the deal was with Mecha Godzilla. But Mecha Godzilla really becomes, in some ways, well, it's based off of other influences like Ultraman or Matt's shirt there, Jet Jaguar. You've got these robot figures inside these great big kaiju battles, these great big monster battles. And especially with Ultraman, it was a TV series that was done by the special effects director for the Godzilla movies. They had all these costumes sitting around, and it's like, we should do something with this stuff. And so they did. And if you watch the series, you'll see thinly disguised Godzilla costumes come on and get their butt kicked by Ultraman. But Ultraman becomes one of the first instances of the robot protector against the monster incursion. There are others. but you know, a fairly famous one. And I'm going to make a huge leap here because there's lots of instances of the robot fighting the giant monster. And one of the ones that I find most interesting in the discussion that I'm introducing you guys to is Neon Genesis Evangelion. Now, the same summer, this is why this stuff is all swirling around in my head, one of the cooks at the camp comes up to me and he says, "Have you seen Neon Genesis Evangelion? I don't even know what you're talking about," I said in response. And he thrust a stack of DVDs into my hands. And he said, "You need to start watching this. You have to have it finished by the end of the summer." I'm like, all right. So I would watch an episode or 2 or 14 every night and try to understand what the heck was going on. It's a strange series, but the best way that I can describe it in brief is somebody looking at this idea of the Christian apocalyptic, of the book of Revelation, bowls of wrath being poured out, monsters coming up out of the sea, angels who don't seem particularly angelic, and things that you just really wouldn't want to have happen, thinking to himself from outside the culture that produced it, well, what would I do if this is what was happening? Like, if I wanted to imagine this as a narrative, if this was really occurring and happening in that way that young man thought of it as a literal thing, then what do? Well, you build giant robots. Why? You build giant robots to resist the apocalypse so that it won't happen. And it was a really interesting thing for me to be watching while I'm working at a Bible camp, right? I felt kind of like I was doing something dodgy, you know, because it's this rewriting of the text. It's a subversion of the text. And yet, when and this was sort of the beginning of the end for my career as a minister, was I would sit there going, but if I really think about this, I don't want any of this to happen, so this makes really good sense, right? This is actually a really good story. I quite like it. I can't tell anybody about that right now, but I'll come out of the closet later. So you have these giant monstrosities, which, in a very anime way, less cutesy than the Pokemon version, resemble some of the creatures that are written about in John's Revelation, in St. John's Apocalypse. These crazy images. There's a number of really great scholarly works that have been written on how John's one of the great voices of madness, actually, because of the way that he sort of presents the world to us. Again, I think that misses that he's working within a pretty strongly defined tradition of apocalyptic imagery, but nevertheless, it's wild and crazy imagery up against these robots that are meant to resist revelation, to bring this down. And the religious imagery in Neon Genesis Evangelion just abounds, right? You've got this company, Nerve, and their motto, "God's in his heaven, all's right with the world," and yet, over and over and over again, we are seeing that is very much not the case. Now, Pacific Rim it pulls from so many of the toolboxes, are the threads that I've put up here, right? It's working with the kaiju films, giant monsters, or giant robots, and giant robots as protectors particularly. There's a lot of people who've said that it stole from Neon Genesis Evangelion. I don't really think it resembles that series enough to make those sorts of accusations. And then there's this very subtle element of the Lovecraftian cultist in it. It comes and it goes. It's hardly there for even a moment. But in the art book, so that's the wonderful thing about the art of the film, is that you can stop and you can take a look at these design ideas that were far more fleshed out in the artist's minds than they ended up being on the screen. And the religion that believes that the kaiju are God's judgment on the earth brings us right back to Wells and Wells's curate, and that passivity of saying, this is what we deserve. We haven't done what is right, and therefore everything that's happening is just what we've got coming to us. And so you get these really cool images, which sadly didn't make it into the film, not these ones in particular. We do get a pretty good look at this kaiju skull that they use as a temple in one scene, and Ron Perlman's character makes a mention of it in brief, but it's not given front and center front and center attention. Nevertheless, the title for this entire sort of talk, this loose agglomeration of ideas at this point, and I do have some very strong thoughts about it that I'm going to get to in just a moment. But that tagline that came out in so many of the trailers, right? We're canceling the apocalypse. So very nicely delivered by Idris Elba in sort of a Braveheartian, Mel Gibson freedom way. Very bombastic, very right? But the idea of canceling the apocalypse is very attractive to me. And these concepts, I did this last year, and then I read Kaiju Rising over the summer. And a number of the stories in this anthology, this is an anthology of giant monster stories, and I thought it was just going to be the worst B crap, the kind of thing I could garden to. And some of it was. Some of it was just the sort of thing that you're just like, I'm just going to enjoy this. It's a fun little roller coaster ride. There were a number of the stories that were playing with the same ideas that I'm talking about in this this talk, where you would have an entire stadium of people waiting for the monster to come because they believe it's part of God's justice or God's judgment. The imagery being given a literalization, like the monster is a giant lamb, because that's how Jesus is portrayed in the book of Revelation as the eschaton, this lamb, and so you have a giant sheep coming, which is just batshit crazy is what it is. But the writer is obviously playing with these ideas and trying to struggle through some of the things that come out of a very literalized apocalypticism in North America. What I find plaguing about the idea of the literalized apocalyptic in North America is firstly that it's theologically unstable. And I knew that when I was working as a minister, that there was a historical reason why America had some very different ideas about how the end of the world happens in Christian theology than you would find in Europe or the UK. But what also bothers me about that is that passivity, that the underlying, that trading in of I will think about this for I will just allow it to happen. When I consider the images from Pacific Rim that look so very similar in my mind to real world atrocity, right? And when that gets close up, when we're talking about real people who are hurt by very real things like tidal waves and storms and volcanoes, and we refer to these even in our legal parlance as acts of God, I look at this image and I say that really happened. That's something that really occurred. Do I ever want to think about any of these things as the thing that just should be happening, right? Whether I'm religious or not. And the idea, and I put this up because I think this is not only an amazing film, but also because I think the title is really telling, very instructive. That we could resist any of these things. Somebody would say, well, that's absolutely impossible. And I would say, yeah, you're right. It's impossible to resist a tsunami. There's no doubt about that. But the moment at which any of these things becomes something that we respond to with passivity or normativity, or just say that's the way things are, is where we lose out on the opportunity to be making a difference. And that's where I think these narratives of resisting revelation, and they abound. I mean, we're not just looking at the giant monster movies, although I suppose these are alongside this. But if you look at the remakes of things like Clash of the Titans, and I know it was a terrible remake, I know it's a terrible film, or the movie Immortals, the underlying narrative is that the gods will be resisted. And if you're going to do like Greek mythology, that doesn't happen in Greek mythology. They know that they can't take the gods on. But now this is being rewritten in these modern narratives, and I think that there's something really, really valuable, because I think as an English prof, obviously I think this, but I also think this because I've been playing over in the fields of plasticity and new like evolutionary psychology and stuff, and finding out how foundational story is to the way that we forge pathways in the brain. And if you're raised with a certain type of story, then you will act in a certain sort of way. And this informs the way that we have differences between cultures, informs the differences between people who grow up in Alberta and people who grow up in PEI. The stories are a bit different, and you'll have those little bits of culture clash when you connect, or more strongly, if somebody is raised in another continent entirely, you're going to have those culture clashes. We just talk about this as difference. But the idea, this is what's coming out of this sort of research, especially in plasticity, is that old dogs can learn new tricks. And if that's so, then cultures can too. And so if cultures can learn new tricks, then these narratives, pop culture that they are, have the potential, at least, to start retelling these narratives, to start saying, no, we'll rewire this, that there is a resistance to the idea of the acts of God, rather than just this passivity. So, all right, that's what I have to talk about. So now I've filled your heads. Let's see what comes back at me. Rotten tomatoes. Yeah.
Is it really canceling or resisting the apocalypse if it happens after the event?
Well, it's still resistance,
Okay.
right? I think. I know what you're saying, right? Like, and that's why I say, like, you can't stand against the tidal wave, right? That just really happens. But I think about it in so many other instances of, like, it's not just acts of God. We can also look at, and this, I hope this doesn't get ridiculously contentious, but I have to be dangerous because that's who I am. All right, so I have friends on social media who are from when I was a minister and I was working in evangelicalism, and I'm sorry to anybody who's a strong evangelical. You can come up and talk to me afterwards. You can beat me up. I will let you do that. But there's an idea in certain branches of evangelicalism where if the Jewish people if Israel doesn't rebuild its temple, Jesus can't come back. It's like he's sitting around somewhere waiting for this to happen. And so you have this apocalyptic concept fueling the view of what's going on in the Middle East. So that it doesn't matter how monstrous Israel's actions become, the thing will always be, well, they're right, and they'll always be right. Why? Because they have to rebuild the temple, because then Jesus can come back. And that's the sort of thing that I think, again, these sorts of narratives are in resistance to, saying, no, if you have the monsters coming from outside, if you have the elder gods moving their way in, then you resist that. You close the portal, you build a giant robot, you say, no, I'm going to think about this. I'm going to evaluate it. I'm not just going to go, well, it's God's judgment, and this is his plan, and we just sort of have to go along with it. Hal Lindsey, there was a guy named Hal Lindsey, wrote a book called The Late Great Planet Earth in the 1980s. And he made all these sorts of predictions based on the book of Revelation about what was going on the political map. And you can still find people like this all the time. You just turn on your television and go to one of the televangelist stations, and there will be some guy who will be telling you that what's going on in the Middle East matches up perfectly with what they found in the book of Revelation, or Daniel, or Zechariah, or something like that. And that's problematic too. I mean, we know that. But again, this is more the intersection of these texts with these ideas. Where you have entire nations being conflated with, the harlot who needs to be, destroyed. This is, Babylon, right? So weather systems are a different thing entirely. But then you have all this other stuff that's sort of on the side. And I think these narratives are an expression of the idea that people are saying, no, absolutely not.
Do you have any ideas about how our resisting certain things, like through science, like advancements in biogenetics, could actually reverse and create these monsters, or
No, I don't have the first thing to think about in that respect. As I understand, it's physically impossible to have a creature that big unless it's in the water. So.
I feel like that's kind of some of a mainstream thought in Christianity, is that our getting too deep into those sorts of concerns are going to come back
that has more to do with tampering with the image of God, as that's at least the conversations that I was party to would often get into that sort of ground. There's also just there's a couple of the churches that I worked with just didn't like the idea that you'd become educated at all, because then it caused you to question. So, being really controversial today. Oh well.
This is going on Facebook, Mike.
I know. It's all right. Eric. I start saying other people's names and we'll all go down together.
This isn't really continuing the conversation, just kind of giving another example that
Sure.
I really enjoy is Ghostbusters, because you have...
No, that is a continuation of the conversation. Yes.
Wonderful example of this narrative. Everybody's like, oh, it's the end of the world. Both the first film and the second film deal with this idea of it's the end of the world. Why are all these ghosts coming out? The dead are rising from the earth. And then, of course, you have the giant destructor monster in Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. And it's wonderful. And one of my favorites, and I think, they really give it heavy-handed. You have Ray and Eddie in the car.
Isn't it the? Oh yeah, I thought you were talking about the mayor's office scene, which I
No,
thought
no,
was so great.
They're sitting in the car, and he's sitting there, and he says, every culture has had a end of the world myth, right? Revelations, whatever it be, and he's like, look, what if this is what's happening? And I love that scene. I think that's like a great example of what we're talking about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, it's funny one. It's a funny one too, and that's the thing, is that like people dismiss this stuff as not having a voice because it's not literary, and yet the influence of these things is very, very strong. And so I think we have to look at it as perhaps it becomes more of a culture study really than a literary one. But we have these expressions all the way back in the 1980s, and I remember sitting and watching Bill Murray giving his lines about everything falling out of the sky and dogs and cats mating or whatever. Yeah. And I remember feeling a little guilty for laughing because I knew it was a joke about my religious tradition, right? But at the same time, it was great, and none of us sat in the theater and thought, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't just don't cross the streams, don't take the risk, because the world should just end, right? And I think even most ardent people of faith would agree with that. But you get these expressions of this where it becomes this, again, this passivity, this thing where we're going to let this happen.
Right. Well, I think it's just great because you have, they're 4 New Yorkers, and of course, who's going to stop the apocalypse other than
New Yorkers? Yeah.
Right? You got a couple of nerds and a couple of guys who are just straight out.
But it's back to the idea of science in involving itself here, because you even look at the way that it gets resisted in these narratives, and it's a scientific thing in the sense, like, if you could build a giant robot, right? This is ridiculous, but it's a technological response.
Right.
So it's not one where you're conjuring something up.
Well, Armageddon, same thing, right?
Oh, with the asteroid. Yeah.
First time in history we've been able to stop this from happening.
That's right. Yeah. I'll come back to it in a second. Go ahead.
What would you think is probably, you're talking about the passivity of, say, apocalypse, giant creature, and especially within Western civilization, kind of just accepting it is happening, and it just becomes normative. What about on the opposite side of the spectrum, where if you have an apocalypse, and let's talk about, dead rising from the graves. If you ask, I would assume any given North American now, they'll have a plan for a zombie outbreak. They're like, oh no, we gotta get ammunition, we gotta get bottled water, off we go. But giant creature, well, that's just not time. I'm just wondering why you think, what do you think that division comes from? Like that kind of acceptance? Like, people are excited for the change, we'll live in a world without work.
That's good.
But I want to live in that world with a giant Godzilla.
Well, the first thing that sort of went through my head was, is the zombie rising from the grave a subversion of the rapture? And then but that would have been rabbit trailing. But I think it's more, I do a talk on how giant monsters, when they're at, like, if the person who's doing a giant monster narrative wants to speak to a social ill, it's not going to be a little one if they're using kaiju. They want it's the kind of thing that we see with acts of God or genocide, or like when you look at Godzilla as metaphor for the bomb, in a very like actually burning your city, as opposed to the zombie as perhaps just wish fulfillment to return to the Wild West.
We just feel that's more plausible, and that's why we're playing.
I don't think anybody thinks it's plausible. I think that you just feel like you could have a survival kit. Whereas if Godzilla rolls up, you're just screwed, right? So your survival plan is radically different. It just involves running away and running away and running away. Or robots, yeah. But then you have to know some physicists or engineers. You have to know people at NASA at that point, I think.
Kind of wondering your opinion on the fact that, with the exception, contemporary apocalyptica, I guess, has always been focused on either physically outmatching something in a giant robot suit, or some sort of outsmarting it, uploading a virus to the alien mothership or whatever. But how come, other than H.G. Wells, because War of the Worlds ended with him getting sick and dying, and it was dumb luck. Why has that not ever really been reapproached, that there is no real order? There's this very contemporary view where it's humanity kicks ass and we're going to beat it back physically or mentally. And then with H.G. Wells, it was, we just happen to be really dumb and lucky. And
emphasis on the dumb.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think it's because I don't think it was that Wells was largely misunderstood, but that people just didn't want to keep going in the direction that he had, which was this criticism of British imperialism by showing the empire what it would be like to have the boot fall on them, right? This technologically advanced culture comes and destroys you in the way that you've been going around and destroying others. And the catching of the cold as a way to get rid of the aliens at the end was one more level of criticism against empire, which was that they had gone out to these other countries and they had caught a bunch of diseases that nearly killed them and caused them to have to withdraw in certain cases. Like malaria kept them out of the deepest, darkest jungles for quite some time. So that commentary isn't as much fun as blowing stuff up, right? And so what gets taken, you even look at most science fiction sequels to any of Wells's work, they just are like social commentary. Who cares? Let's do some cool stuff with Martians and time machines and invisible men and what have you. But I think the same question could be asked about, when you look at the original Godzilla movie, which again is social commentary, and then you look at every other Godzilla movie, you can't find another, with maybe one or two exceptions, that even attempt that kind of commentary in that way. And I think that has a lot more to do with audience reception of these narratives than it does with anything else. Like, we will give the masses what they want. We made a decent amount of money when we did it as a social commentary, but look what happens when we made him fight King Kong. And so I think that has a lot to do with it. I'm not sure if that answered your question adequately, Matt.
Well, it just, you would know way more about this than I would, but in biblical revelation, isn't it sort of solved by,
God?
Oh, Jesus just happens to show up and
God
everything's
shows up.
great. So
Deus Ex Machina.
Yeah.
Except,
So
it's
sort
not,
of
because
That's the whole
you
point.
can't talk about Deus Ex Machinas in the Bible, can you?
But it's sort of it's still kind of the thing where essentially it is, in a sense, just stupid luck, like just the universe just working out correctly.
Yeah.
So isn't that why is that not really been latched onto? Because I guess like you said, it is a way better story to watch someone, machine gun a monster. But I guess it depends on what you're trying to achieve with the story.
I now have an idea, but I'm gonna let Kyle go first.
I was going to just bring up the whole, at one point you mentioned that a lot of the change in apocalyptic literature came from America's very specific view on it. And I think in kind of commenting on that, the difference between the British's view of it versus the Americans, who are always as a culture and as a history resistant to everything. A lot of it probably comes from that, and that's why, because America is largely in control of media these days, and that's why we probably don't get a lot of the, oh, let's lay back and hope they die kind of narratives anymore. You
Yeah,
get
they're
the
not happy with
fight
that
back,
as an
rah,
ending.
rah, rah,
Yeah.
Semper Fi, etc.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I was thinking about, because you use the example, Matt, of Independence Day, right? We're going to upload the virus. And Independence Day, ID4, is War of the Worlds.
It's just the virus is now
The
updated.
American
Yes, and we made the virus, and we gave it to them, and because it's Will Smith and Jeff Goldblum, and that's how we roll. You even look at Battle Los Angeles.
Do I have to?
You do. I had my students when I was doing War of the Worlds, like, you gotta watch Battle Los Angeles. So I finally did, and the first 2/3 of the movie, I was like, all right. And then they got to the part where they got to the base. They're just trying to get to the base. The whole movie is let's get to the base, let's get to the base, let's get to the base. It's an alien invasion film for those of you who haven't seen it. And they get their asses kicked for the first 2/3 of the film. And then they finally get to the base where everything was going to be okay, and it's just been razed to the ground. And you have this moment of, and I'm like, end it! End the movie now! Because this is how this should end. No, 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 no. And here's that Semper Fi thing, right here. It's Bruce Willis in Die Hard. He really can't beat them till he's been beaten black, blue, and bloody, right? Then, suddenly, he can do whatever it is that he needs to. And in the final third of that film, you see the distinct difference between the American narrative of these things versus, you know, some other possible narratives. And I wouldn't want to say it's just that culture, because I think there are others that are doing it. But yeah, there's a huge difference in how War of the Worlds gets reread once it becomes the alien invasion film of American society. I also think it's one of the reasons that so many people hated Spielberg's version of War of the Worlds, is because he did the same thing that Spielberg did. He just had them die. And I remember being with people who, you know, they see the movie and they'd be like, it was such a stupid ending. And I'm like, well, what did you mean? Well, they just died. And, you know, boy, what? They got sick? Yes. It's a stupid ending. They should have ended it like Wells's book. They do. Right? That's also because a lot of people think that the radio version of War of the Worlds by Orson Welles is the same thing as War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, and so you get all sorts of confusion over those things as well. I want to make sure that I get across that when I say resisting, I'm not saying I think we can stop any of these things from happening, but rather that we involve ourselves in making it right, you might say. There's a guy out in Vancouver, and I'm not going to remember his name, so if you're interested, send me an email. But he wrote a book called Apocalypse Recalled, and he works at a theological school. And he did a variant reading of Revelation, not as a text that was meant to, because if you read Revelation as a coded letter for Christians under persecution in Rome, then everything that happens is just supposed to be what's already going on. It's not this will happen way down the road somewhere. It's like this is happening right now because if Nero's been putting us on torches and dipping us in tar and using us to light the streets to blame for something something that he did. But this guy said, I'm not really sure that that's what the point of this text is. I have to wonder if it isn't a text that's supposed to make complacent, because he said by the time this text was being written, Christianity was already becoming a thing. It was already getting pretty settled. And so there's just as likely a possibility that what he was doing is he was taking a religion that was already starting to become fat and lazy and saying, we need to be about, making things better, making the world a better place. And his book is very challenging in that respect. And so that's really where these ideas sort of come out of, is the idea of recalling the apocalypse, pulling it back and saying, well, rather than seeing this as something that's inevitable, why don't we just see this as something that occurs and something that we are supposed to redress as humans? It's our role in what goes on. When I did this last year at the Edmonton Expo, I encouraged everybody to give to some form of disaster relief, because that's one way in which it can be done.
It's almost like you're doing an intersection, and I don't want to get too religious here, but of Revelation and Job, that
I was thinking of this earlier,
Oh,
so
okay.
go on.
Well, just the idea that, like, you know, here's a man who's completely shat on by
Yeah.
everything that's happening to him.
Yes.
He loses his home and his family and his life, and he gets plagued and just is in misery, but he doesn't renounce what's happening to him, and his friends come and say, you know, just curse God, and he's like, no man, I'm not gonna do it. But then he has this very eloquent, like, speech at the end that he gives where he doesn't understand what's happening, and then God shows up and is like, well,
Suck it up,
yeah,
buttercup.
suck it up.
Yeah.
But this idea that, you know, maybe it's another lens or another perspective where, you know, as humanity can come together and commiserate together in spite of everything that's happening, and it's just gonna happen anyways.
Yeah. Well, and I thought of that. It was one of the things that, for whatever reason, rolled around in my head when Matt asked his question earlier about, like, why do we have those differences with these types of endings. And right away, I thought, even within the biblical tradition, you have you know, Job in the Hebrew Bible, in the Tanakh, with this story which ends with bad shit happens.
And you don't get an answer.
You don't get an answer. Revelation seems to, you know, give you this dun, 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 like Jesus' Lone Ranger coming in and saving the day at the very end. But God in the Tanakh, he comes in, and it's right after, it's fun because there's still kaiju there. You get two giant monster descriptions, the behemoth and the leviathan, in God's explanation for why we don't know why bad things happen. And so that's a tension of conversation there as well. So I like that, you know, that you saw that there's that potential intersection of those things there as well. At the very least, I don't think there's anything particularly unbiblical about resisting it. The Jewish imagination was very comfortable with contradiction as a form of conversation. But it's, again, you have modern evangelicalism where it's like, when we have to have the right answer. Something else, by the way, that's just, no, that's not, it's
I'm sort of curious to hear, like, what your thoughts may be on the ending of, say, Cabin in the Woods, where they fight through the entire movie to survive, and at the end they choose to basically
Yes.
lay down and die to allow this thing to come back.
Yeah. I don't know how serious I could be with my answer to that, because it's such a funny ending. Because what you have is you have these two stoner slackers. They're like, man, maybe we should just let whatever's coming through come through, which I just think is hysterically funny.
Yes.
But I was thinking about it. I can even think about exactly where I was. I can remember grabbing the door to my house to walk in, and because I was thinking about this talk coming up, and I thought about, well, what about Cabin in the Woods, Perschon? How does that fit? And so now you're asking me, and my answer is I don't really know yet. I'm not sure that all of them do, because one of the wonderful things about where narratives are at is that we have that position of tension where you have a narrative saying this and you have another narrative over here saying something else, and then you have to pull those, you know, to sort of try to grasp at the truth, I guess, between them. I don't know. I would say just don't let the stoner be the one here. I love that Shaggy character in that.
I feel like with Cabin in the Woods, it's a little bit of a different theme, because, I mean, these are
Yes.
all kind of like act of God things, where what they're resisting at the end is just kind of the status quo, and the status quo is horrifying, right? You have these...
Yeah, the bureaucratic Cthulhuites.
Yeah, right, yeah, and they're basically, they're sacrificing these kids in order to make sure that everything keeps going on the way it is, and that's not necessarily apocalyptic per se. I mean, it ends in
It
a
is, it
but-
sure does.
It does, it
Big
does end that way,
fist.
but I think, I mean, earlier on in the film, you have, again, your stoner character, and he's like, we just got, there's, you know, we're being watched all the time, everything's too connected, we need to, like, tear things apart and move on and get things better. So maybe, for me, it's always been more of a rejection of that status quo and being more like, well, let it fall apart. It's got to eventually.
Yeah,
So,
and let something else take its
rather
place.
than trying to violently keep it together, let's just kind of let it go and see what happens, right? And in a way, that's kind of apocalyptic to what we have in our life now, but maybe something better will come out of that. Of course, in that narrative, it's different. They're all getting smashed by a giant hand.
Well, yeah, and it's also, Cabin in the Woods is also this meta-commentary on the horror film,
Yeah.
right? So there's also that to keep in mind. I know you don't think so. Well, maybe you just don't think it's a good meta-commentary, but you got to admit it's meta-commentary.
Swings through the point.
Sure. Anything else? Sure.
I just wanted to walk further. This all kind of reminds me of that new anime Attack on Titan, where like,
Yeah.
the monsters are like 90% successful, but humanity continues to like resist. Like it is pathetically hobbled as it is. It still continues to sort of move on.
Yeah, absolutely. It is another example of this. The only reason I went yah is because I just think it's a really cool looking anime. I don't have anything brilliant to say other than that. Sometimes you just gotta squeak.
I was curious, you brought up Neon Genesis as an example of a different culture looking at this American view on apocalypse. Have you ever seen an anime called Fist of the North Star? Or is it okay?
No, but Matt's been telling me I need to see it. So.
I was thinking about, because you mentioned about making it right. It's a ridiculous show. The protagonist is this guy who...
It's Jesus.
Essentially, yeah.
It's Jesus.
At
He's
one
karate
point,
Jesus.
The protagonist punches a tank to death with his bare hands. It's awesome. But yeah, he's fighting back against these Mad Max-esque groups of, roving bandits and spike bracelets and bondage gear, whatever they were, like in Mad Max.
The sort of thing you see all over the place.
Essentially, Japan's take on Mad Max.
Sure.
But the way I see it is, this is post-apocalyptic Japan, presumably Japan, and he is just barraging through all of these groups, almost as if he is making it right, as if he is this, holy paragon figure in some sort of. You shaking your head there?
Oh no, because he's totally not in the end, because he kills everyone.
I never watched it.
Oh, okay.
Oh, spoiler! Spoiler!
The movie or the series?
Series.
Okay, I was only like 100 episodes in. It was after.
What? 100 episodes?
It's like 200.
I stopped watching it after he killed Seller.
Okay, no, that's where you.
Okay, now they're having